This girl makes a secret signal to a millionaire at the airport, saying something shocking. She was taking a big risk, so the millionaire acts fast and 100 cop cars show up outside, but something worse happens later. Comment, giving my story a rating from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The screams sliced through the stifling afternoon air like a razor, echoing through the brick streets of the small, historic town at precisely 3 o'clock. 52-year-old millionaire widower Richard Harding nearly spilled his coffee as he stepped away from his luxury condo window. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the clapboard house across the street, a faded yellow two-story with peeling blue shutters that clashed with the sleek lines of the modern building where he lived. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie before returning to his work. As the owner of one of the largest construction companies in the region, he was used to solving complex problems, but he preferred to stay away from other people's dramas. Especially after 5 years of living alone, ever since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. His fortune, built over decades investing in the stock market and expanding his business, provided him with every material comfort imaginable, but didn't fill the emotional void he carried. Across the street, inside the clapboard house, the 4-year-old girl curled up in the corner of the kitchen, her tiny arms unable to comprehend why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman tightly gripped a metal spoon she'd heated on the gas stove, her eyes bloodshot from the alcohol, fixed on the child trembling before her. "You're a curse on this house," the cruel aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the whiskey she'd been drinking since noon at the local dive bar, O'Malley's. "Because of you, my sister's gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that joined the other scars, dotting her thin arms. The child bit her lip to stifle another scream. She'd learned that screaming only enraged her aunt further, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absenteeism caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before she went to sleep. It was all that remained of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Quit your sniveling," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow, and if you smudge the walls again with that filthy charcoal, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up under the thin blanket and began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it while she cooked, a popular tune about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the clapboard house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, tremulous but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that touched a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. Next door to the clapboard house, the 61-year-old retired schoolteacher, Mrs. Eleanor Abernathy, was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. "That's strange," she thought, observing the windows of the neighboring house, a family she had known for decades. The aunt had always been troubled, But since she took custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the atmosphere of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in the historic town. Mrs. Abernathy dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had properly talked to the aunt, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little girl better. The businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of his former employee, who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the accident. She was a kind woman, always humming while she organized the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought of her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clutched the blanket, and in her dreams she flew like the bird she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the millionaire closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell on the historic town, but the echo of that children's lullaby continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running from his responsibilities, and a teacher who had never been able to ignore a child's suffering. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical movement of the historic town awakening for another day. The retired schoolteacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the clapboard house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a puffy face and bloodshot eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's binge. "Good morning," said the teacher with her most gentle smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper chat." The aunt hesitated, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Abernathy, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The educator took a step forward, forcing the woman to retreat. "And I'd love to meet your niece. I hear she's an adorable little girl." The aunt's face hardened for an instant before forcing a weak smile. She's sick, high fever, best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," the visitor insisted. "I have experience with sick children. Raised 3 of my own, you know." "No need, really," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a cold. She'll be over it soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her even so early in the morning. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while eating breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confusing dreams where a child's voice mixed with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the clapboard house, a strange curiosity washed over him. The educator finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an investigative glance into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the clapboard house, the aunt slammed the door shut and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the woman growled, her irritation intensified by her hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Auntie," the girl mumbled, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like making so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high fences and dominated by a single apple tree. There, she sat on the dirt and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the gas stove. They were always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the child in the yard under the hot midday sun. The girl began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee used to hum that same song while she worked. She who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. The woman who always spoke fondly about her little daughter. A girl named... Her daughter, the millionaire murmured, the cell phone trembling in his hands. His former employee's daughter was named exactly like the child who was suffering in the house across the street. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The child who was suffering in the clapboard house was the daughter of the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years, before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made this connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered his former employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, her daughter was across the street, and from the sounds that came from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried multiplied, now including regret for not helping when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock sharp, the screaming started again. This time, the millionaire didn't step away from the window. He watched with growing horror as, through the kitchen window of the clapboard house, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently in the direction of a small figure he could barely distinguish. The child's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time he couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? His fortune in stocks and investments had always given him the power to solve business problems. But this was different. It was personal. It was about a child who should have been under his indirect protection 5 years ago when her mother worked for him. That night, the girl slept on the floor of the yard, where her aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her away from that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's passing. 3 days passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired school teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the Clapham house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting another direct visit to the cruel aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 o'clock in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from which she had the best view of the backyard of the neighboring house. What she saw horrified her. The 4-year-old girl was sitting under the apple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing in the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hands trembling as she held onto the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined. Much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the educator's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, honey," replied the teacher, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" The child glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine, I'm just drawing birdies." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot." "They can fly wherever they want," replied the girl, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the older woman's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Where are you, girl?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the yard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine rage burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best dress, grabbed a tray of homemade cookies that she had prepared as a pretext, and headed back to the Clapham house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "Mrs. Abernathy, I already told you it's not a good time." "Dear, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," interrupted the educator firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little one better. As long-time neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the clapboard house was dark and smelled of mold mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," the aunt lied, blocking the way to the back of the house. "What a shame." "Maybe another time then," said the teacher, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the gas stove, and most importantly, small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," the aunt said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The educator smiled and nodded, but had decided that she had already seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always next door if you need anything. Anything at all." The tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help, it was a subtle but direct warning. After the teacher left, the aunt slammed the door shut and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard the visitor's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," the woman accused, her eyes already flashing with familiar rage. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt picked up the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The child recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to get attention, don't you?" the woman hissed as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here asking questions. Do you think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone on the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated worker who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. As the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the millionaire made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend, David Miller. "David, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the child's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it may be a matter of life or..." His fortune, accumulated in decades of investments and financial applications, had always given him power to solve problems, but he had never faced anything so personal and urgent. His assets and net worth could buy many things, but they couldn't erase the time lost or undo the suffering already caused. That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room couch, the girl managed to slip silently into the yard. Her new burns were throbbing, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the apple tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's lullaby softly. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering, and that in the coming days her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The teacher, in her house next door, couldn't sleep. She had made a decision that would set everything in motion. The next morning, she would make a call she could no longer postpone. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at the university for nearly 3 decades, and the lawyer knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," said the lawyer, sitting down in the spacious living room of the apartment. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The millionaire poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street. is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who cares for her." "Mistreated how?" asked the lawyer, taking a notepad from his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The businessman paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, evidence of what's happening." The lawyer was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," replied the millionaire, running his hands over his face. "But there's something else. My ex-employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before the accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," completed the lawyer, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with that woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and the lawyer could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "Does this happen every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 o'clock. Religiously. But sometimes at other times too," replied the millionaire, picking up his cell phone. "Want to see the recordings?" The lawyer watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a family law specialist, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something about the systematization of that violence deeply disturbed him. While the two men planned the intervention, across town, the retired teacher was making her own crucial call. She had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the child in the yard, the marks she had seen on the girl's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. "Annie, I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," said the educator on the phone, speaking to a former student of hers who now worked at Child Protective Services. "Mrs. Abernathy, so good to hear your voice. What can I do for you?" "A child in danger. My neighbor. I'm sure she's being mistreated." The counselor straightened up in her chair, her voice becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years in the position, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and Mrs. Abernathy was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," said Annie, picking up a complaint form. While the teacher reported her observations across town, the lawyer was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened attentively as the lawyer presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," said the prosecutor, examining the videos. "I will order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will that take?" asked the lawyer, concerned. "With this evidence?" "We can act today," replied the prosecutor. "I'll contact Child Protective Services now." That's how, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, 2 simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. Annie was finishing writing down the teacher's report when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services," Annie speaking. "Annie, this is the district attorney. I need you to make an urgent intervention in a house on Brick Street. We have evidence of severe child abuse." Annie paused, her pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by any chance the yellow clapboard house?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," replied Annie, surprised. "2 independent sources. That confirms the gravity of the situation." At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. Annie, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading to the clapboard house. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. The lawyer was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," said the lawyer, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the millionaire, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the clapboard house. In the house, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol at the local bar, leaving the child locked in the stuffy room. The girl kept singing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When Annie knocked on the door of the clapboard house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was the teacher who first heard the weak voice coming from the room in the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team down the hallway. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child looked up with big, frightened eyes, not understanding who these people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, honey," said Annie, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Annie. We're here to help you." The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the kind lady who had spoken to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. "Auntie will be mad," she whispered. "You don't have to worry about that now," said the educator, reaching out to the girl. "We're going to get out of here, okay?" But the big twist was yet to come. While Annie conducted the legal procedures, the businessman came down from his apartment for the first time in weeks. He had made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. He approached the teacher, who was waiting outside the clapboard house while the Child Protective Services team organized the removal of the child. "Mrs. Abernathy, my name is—" he began, but she interrupted him. "I know who you are. You've lived in the building across the street for years. That girl," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Her mother used to work for me. Before she passed away. I feel responsible for what happened." The teacher studied him for a moment. "And what do you intend to do with that feeling?" The millionaire took a deep breath. Throughout his life, he had used his wealth to solve problems from afar, through lawyers and intermediaries. But this time would be different. His fortune in investments, his stock market earnings, his wealth built over decades, all of it would finally have a purpose greater than simply accumulating capital. "I want to adopt her," he said, the words coming out with a conviction that surprised him. "I want to give her everything her mother would have wanted her to have." When the girl was finally taken from the house, carrying only a piece of charcoal she used to draw her birds, the businessman approached her. The child looked at him with curiosity, without fear, perhaps because unconsciously she recognized in him something familiar from the time when her mother was still alive. "Do you like to draw birds?" he asked gently, kneeling down to be at her height. The girl nodded shyly. "I have a big house with a huge garden. There are lots of real birds there. Would you like to see them?" For the first time in months, the child smiled. A genuine smile, full of hope. And at that moment, the businessman knew that his life had also changed forever. 6 months later, the girl was running freely through the garden of her new home, feeding the birds that had previously only existed in her drawings. The millionaire discovered that his greatest wealth wasn't in his financial applications or his net worth in dollars, but in the laughter of that child who had learned to fly again. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you daily videos that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.